in clause 5 under the purpose and application section of the bill, I should say on page 8, it says, for greater certainty, this act does not apply in respect of personal information that has been anonymized. So the debate I think that we're having right now is, one, we heard from witnesses like Ms. Skaza, who talked about almost the impossibility of de-identifying data based on the best practices that exist out there, that we can never be 100% sure. That's very clear. She did outline that the department seems to be very much on the side of some of those big corporations that want as much leeway as possible in the design of anonymization and de-identification to protect their corporate interests and their business interests. That's fine. That's their objective, and I acknowledge that, whether or not I agree with it. But if we're making a comparison with the Quebec law, does the Quebec law exempt anonymized data from the scope and application of the bill? So my question more specifically, is there for greater certainty in Quebec's law that would not apply in respect of personal information that has been anonymized? So is there something similar in Quebec's legislation like we have on page 8?
We're consulting, Mr. Chair. The Quebec law states that if it's anonymized by the definitions contained in the regulations, then it is out of scope of their privacy law.
So Quebec's law does the de-identified data does not apply.
Anonymized data.
Anonymized but not de-identified.
Anonymized data, as defined, as set out, is outside of the scope. Once it's been deemed anonymized, it is outside of the scope of the Quebec privacy law, similar to what would occur in the case of the CPPA.
Okay, thank you. That was my main question.
Thank you, Mr. Viss. J'aurais Monsieur Garon sur ma liste et c'est la dernière.
Mr. Garon, it's the last name I have on my list for now, so please go ahead. Well, my question is somewhat of a follow-up on the fit between the Quebec bill and this wording. There's been some argumentation on the part of the government. We've discussed this in private as well. The fact that the Quebec bill refers to best practices. It does give reference to best practices. And the manner in which it is drafted in C-27 would in fact mirror the language of the Quebec Act. But I don't think that's true, because we do refer to best practices in the Quebec law, but businesses would anonymize data as determined by the government of Quebec by regulation. So there are best practices. They exist, of course, but I don't, Mr. Massé was making the same point. What was the name of that group there? Canon? Well, it's a lobby. It's a lobby group. They represent a number of enterprises, and they come here to try to influence this legislation. We understand that. And they should be on the lobby registry. I'm not at all convinced that there won't be industry that's going to establish its own practices, and it won't be in any way compliant with the Quebec Act. Doesn't the government really want to establish some minimum criteria? I need to be convinced, but it's going to be hard to convince me. Thank you very much, Mr. Garon, Mr. Turnbull.
So I wanted to bring in, just because of the NDP2 and G2, which is another amendment that the government has proposed, which I think you all have, because the two are dependent upon one another. If NDP is voted through, then G2 is no longer able to be. So I want to bring this in because it has an impact on perhaps the debate we're having and the alignment with Quebec's law, which I think Mr. Garon is rightfully pointing out. And I think perhaps just understanding why reasonably foreseeable risk is something that is needed in order to align with Quebec's law. Mr. Shand, can you perhaps comment on that and how that concept is also both relevant but also strengthens privacy protection?
Yeah, and so from what we have consulted and analyzed in view of a number of experts, including academics and privacy researchers, and the concept of reasonably foreseeable, which is a well-established principle in law, it's mentioned almost 50 times in the existing PIPEDA, which we believe regulators and courts are adept at interpreting, is a necessary construct. Not including that term would have a potential chilling impact on the use of the technique, which ultimately leads to negative outcomes for privacy protection, because we actually think there should be increased uses of anonymization to try and render as much of the information utilized in that format rather than in identifiable or de-identifiable formats, because of the privacy protecting value of that. And in fact, using anonymized data sets could help in a number of heavy data user kind of applications, including potentially in the space of AI. And so I think that's our view of why reasonably foreseeable is an important construct.
I understand. I'm not a lawyer, but I understand that concept is very well embedded in the law, so it's quite well understood, reasonably foreseeable. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so as I noted, reasonably foreseeable has been included in a number of statutes, but it particularly has a strong interpretive value that's been added to the existing private sector privacy law in PIPEDA, because it appears there many times and is understood as a construct that is can be tested by both regulators and courts as to whether or not it was understood by the individual at the time, whether or not they had taken appropriate mechanisms to anonymize the information.
Does it raise the bar on the obligations set out in the Act for companies to abide by adding reasonably foreseeable? It seems to me it raises the bar even further, perhaps. Would you agree?
I think what we're pointing to by both reasonably foreseeable and generally best practices is to essentially further test the assumption that someone can just say, well, I anonymized it, and to my mind, it was anonymized, to which then by saying, well, but was it reasonably foreseeable that it was anonymized? Did you actually test it against the available technologies and what was out in the field? And then under generally best practices, did you draw on the very best tools to ensure that you were actually rendering it unre-identifiable? And I think both of those elements do raise the bar, because it actually suggests yet again that someone can't just kind of throw up their hands and indicate that to their mind it was anonymized.
So what's the argument for building in generally accepted best practices and reasonably foreseeable? I understand that both may align with Quebec's law, notwithstanding Mr. Garon's point, which I think is a very good one, that perhaps embedding requirement for things to be specified in regulation may actually strengthen it further and address some of the concerns from my colleagues across the way here that I think all have expressed the same concern that industry shouldn't be setting the standards themselves, but in fact it should be a regulation, perhaps. Can you?
I think there's.
Sorry, I kind of went on and on. My apologies. I have a tendency to do that sometimes. Just to be clear, the question I was asking: what's the argument between best practice, having generally accepted best practices, and reasonably foreseeable?
reasonably foreseeable aligns with the generally best practices in the sense that if it was reasonably foreseeable, one has to draw on those generally acceptable best practices on the anonymization front. In that, if you're not, if you're holding both ends, essentially reasonably foreseeable, but then you're also mandating that people are really up to date on the best practices for anonymization, you're essentially linking those two to say, if it was reasonably foreseeable, in part because you're actually using the generally acceptable best practices.
So they sort of, they mutually support one another. They're kind of complementary concepts, and they both align with Quebec's law, although there's one key difference that in terms of the way that if we voted down NDP2 and kept generally accepted best practices, and we support G2, which is reasonably foreseeable, it aligns with Quebec's law, but the only element that doesn't completely align is having the regulation, the one that specifies both.
That's correct.
And so I think, what I'd like to propose to my colleagues is that we vote down NDP2 and that we embed a wording that includes best practices to be defined in regulation. And I have suggested wording for that. If we get to G2, I'd be happy. But I do think that we need generally accepted best practices in there in order for those to be defined by regulation. So, and I think that addresses some of the concerns that have been expressed, which I think are valid concerns to have. If the concern is that industry groups can essentially define best practices however they want, this would account for that and would essentially make it dependent upon regulation, which I think would strengthen it and would allow for certainly consultation to be done, because I think that would be very important, but that the regulations would be set or those best practices would be defined essentially by the government and the OPC. So, and this would align, I believe, with Quebec's law. So it's what I would propose as a compromise here, given the debate that we've had. And I hope that maybe we can vote down NDP2 together and then move in good faith on a sub-amendment to G2, which would strengthen it in the way that I've suggested here. Thanks.
Merci beaucoup. J'ai Monsieur Viss.
Thank you. Mr. Biss.
Two questions for clarification. Per my last question, I might have missed it. Did you say in Quebec's law has a similar clause to Clause 5 for greater certainty like we have on page 8 of the law? Or was that solely in regulation that Quebec deems anonymized data as not subject to its act?
It's not the same clause, potentially to clarify, but it is the same outcome, which is that anonymized information is not subject to the act.
Okay, but that is that's through regulation, or that's embedded in the statute?
So the statute says information anonymized under this act must be anonymized according to generally accepted best practices and according to the criteria and terms determined by regulation. Is Article 23, and the name of the article is destruction or anonymized. So when you get rid of personal information, you're either destroying it or turning it into anonymous information, so you can't re-identify.
Okay, and once it's anonymized to a standard acceptable by the government of Quebec, then it is no longer subject to the statute.
This is why it's in the same category as
As
destructed information.
Thank you. Okay. My second question relates to the broad discussion we've had, but it's a question that hasn't been asked yet. Does C-27 provide for the scenario whereby data once deemed anonymized under the possibility of new technology is deemed to be re-identified? Would it be therefore subject to the act again if that data was re-identified? Is there a clause you can specify in the bill that addresses that scenario?
So that's one of the things that generally accepted best practices does. It requires organizations to ensure that their information is anonymized in accordance with generally accepted best practices. Those practices evolve. For example, ISO has a standard on anonymization. That standard may evolve. If you're no longer compliant with that, with those generally accepted standards, then your information is no longer anonymized pursuant to the Act, and then it becomes identifiable and therefore becomes personal information.
Okay, my concern would be that I just, based on what the Privacy Commissioner said, I don't see why just the term anonymize would preclude the use of best practices in regulation. And from what we heard, if we, yeah, I'll stop right there. I think, yeah,
Merci,
I'm good.
Monsieur Vice. J'ai Jean-Denis Garon.
Mr. Viss and then Mr. Garon, and we'll carry on. Well, I'm addressing myself to you, and I feel a little bit ill at ease because the process as it led us to the clause by clause is not evident. The department has consulted privately. They met with individuals or organizations. We don't have any documentary result from that. As a parliamentarian, it's quite difficult for me. I'm sure it's not a choice made by the officials themselves, but they're trying to sell us this bill a lot more than answering our questions. And I don't know where the information comes from. So I find that very difficult vis-a-vis the trust that we have in that. We're looking to align it with the Quebec bill. And in Quebec, they say we can regulate, and we should. So maybe they're pitching us something here. They're trying to sell us this. We're working in good faith. I'm not trying to do a filibuster here, but parliamentary work is quite difficult. I know it wasn't your choice, but you're trying to pitch us something here. We want answers. We don't know all that went on. We don't know exactly what the corresponding regulations and laws are in each province, for example. But I don't see why you couldn't just simply accept that and make sure that it is aligned with the Quebec process. It's quite problematic for us as parliamentarians, and we have to be very rigorous. So I have a question. Is it up to the industry to determine what are best practices? And how can we arrive at some compromise on that? I saw the other amendment from my colleagues suggesting that enterprises should conform to best practices as outlined in regulation. Would that leave the government the opportunity to not regulate and not adopt any regulations and leave it up to industry to decide what are best practices? The law is already drafted that way. It seems to be the preference for the government. Can the government take the decision to not regulate? Well, thank you for the question. It really depends on the specific wording in there. If it's a prescribed, as prescribed in regulations, well, then the government has to provide regulations. Anonymize means to modify in a permanent way personal information in keeping with best practices in order to assure that there is no reasonably foreseeable risk in the circumstances that an individual can be identified directly in any way whatsoever other than in methods prescribed by regulation. So concretely, where does that leave us?
Comme dit comme ça, ça indique que le règlement.
Well, I would indicate that regulations, well,
It's required to be able to fully live out the clause, and so the government would be under obligation to have the regulations in place to be able to further the effort.
Parce que, à ma compréhension,
well, in my comprehension, it's not the commissioner or federal or provincial that would be doing that. You know, it would be an empty regulation. No, what? I'm trying to understand, really. We're trying to do the right thing here. Mr. Masse has indicated that in case, if there's any doubt, the standard has to be very, very high. What the government was saying in its original proposals was to let business take care of it. Well, we're trying to find a compromise here to understand which compromise is being effected here by way of regulation. Well, suppose we remove best practices. There's a very, very important role. Gives business a lot of authority and power here, encroaching on that of the OPC rather. Very important protections are going to be in the hands of business. Now, generally respected best practices, usually that's set by the industry. Mr. Turnbull is looking for a compromise here. So, if government, with the sub-amendment as proposed by Mr. Turnbull, would allow the government to remove itself from its responsibilities. Do you understand? Well, there are three aspects to this. The introduction of a concept of best practice gives us an interim standard that can be used to use a proper methodology to anonymize. That's what the regulations would call for. We need standards that are clear, unambiguous, for the management of the data. Second aspect, with enforcement measures taken by the authorities, we can continue to promote or accept the continuous ongoing evolution of technique by enforcement standards.
Come even further precision about how this will be understood, and so in the absence at outset there'll be a commitment that you have to use the best technology available. That will then get laid out in the regulation making process, which is consultative by nature, and then further established in enforcement.
Okay.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Garon.
Thank you, Mr. Garon. Mr. Massé.
Reinforce that I think are very important. I know that we're talking a little bit about G2 as well, which got introduced later on and apparently needs some fixing. But the first argument the government had against this, you actually try to use the Privacy Commissioner against the Privacy Commissioner, who the Privacy Commissioner still stands by the suggested change for a lot of different reasons, and that hasn't altered. The second part was to use the fear factor with Quebec, which has been diminished in all important aspects because the reality is that the former Commissioner of Quebec's Information noted that there's important distinction in the regimes, and actually what this could do is actually provide more protection for Quebec through the Privacy Commissioner. So that's an important distinction to make. If we are going to move to some type of regulation, that also means taking away from Parliament and putting that in the hands of others, more importantly, that are less independent. And I cannot see for the life of me, when we look at best practices, how it's then assumed that the Privacy Commissioner that would have the worst practices In fact, the privacy commissioner could actually have awesome practices. It could be quite different than that of the best practice argument. And I can tell you some industries at many times, best practices included things like, I don't know, like not having seatbelts in cars or to be optional in cars. Those are different times and point where we've had to change and alter. And we have an industry here that's emerging that's very important. And I, again, think it's a philosophical thing. I do not want to lend this go back to the government. And it was interesting to hear the arguments about this, to keep this in here from organizations that have on their board of directors Loblaws, Sun Life, Private AI, TELUS, Microsoft, TD Bank, BMO, CIBC, RBC, Rogers, Magna, 2 of them, Metrolinx, a whole bunch of other lawyers and so forth. And that was the primary discussion used to actually support this. So with that, I hope that we can move on to a vote. I think it's important that we have this philosophical point kind of finished in the sense that I'm siding with the privacy commissioner, I'm siding with the public interest, I'm siding with that versus taking it out of our hands and, more importantly, giving influence to the backrooms, lobbying, and other nefarious organizations that may not have the public interest at heart, but they have your information interest at heart.
Merci, Monsieur Massé. J'ai Monsieur Williams suivi de...
Mr. Williams, followed by Mr. Turnbull.
And I do agree we need to get this to a vote. Look, I think this is a long, good debate. This is a really good debate because I think it looks at the core of what we're trying to protect here. I believe that when we introduce language other than the simplest language, especially for anonymized, we are actually introducing ambiguity in the fact that it is going to be the private commissioner and the courts that set precedents. As my colleague, Mr. Massey, just mentioned, it's going to the privacy commissioner who's going to give best practices, and the courts through precedents who will look at cases and then set those best practices for business. It's not up to the government to have an evolving list, because when it was mentioned from the GDPR, and why does the GDPR, which we consider the gold standard for privacy, not explicitly define generally accepted best practices? Because they say it aims to provide a broad framework that can adapt to evolving technologies and societal norms. And that's because they've removed it, not because they're adding it in. And the reason for that is Parliament can in no ways be as quick as business can be to protect it, but also can in no way be as quick as can be to ensure that it gets out of the way. And if we want businesses to protect privacy, it's going to the privacy commissioner, who has to be the end-all to what privacy is and how it's debated and how it's adhered to. And again, the courts would be the final say. But adding language in, including there is no reasonable foreseeability, because again, we're not adding context to that, adding accepted best practices without concrete context to that is adding ambiguity to anonymization, which we don't want in a bill that is supposed to protect privacy for Canadians. So for both of those amendments, we'll be voting no, and hopefully to move on to the important parts of this bill. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Turnbull.
Well, not surprising. We've already had the debate, but Mr. Williams, I respectfully disagree with the fact that you referenced something about keeping up to date and evolving, which is exactly what the best practices, generally accepted best practices, is designed to do. I've sent around a sub-amendment for G2, just because Mr. Garon and I discussed it, and he was referencing it, and I wanted to make sure that every
Mr.
member
Turnbull,
had
just
the wording.
1 second, Mr. Turnbull, Mr. Massé, on a point of order.
I understand that you have some latitude that's necessary for this, but now we're trading notes on a future amendment without dealing with the current amendment in front of us. So there's, I think, at a certain point in time, we have to deal with the amendment in front of ourselves.
Correct. Yeah.
We do,
Can I
of
speak
course.
to that? Point of order?
I'll respond to that. We do, of course, Mr. Massé, you're correct, and we will, in any event, deal with NDP2 before we go any further. However, given that G2 is rendered moot, if NDP2 is adopted, I think it's fair to allow for a discussion of the amendments going forward as well, because they're impacted by the two.
I guess that's
But
fine.
we're not
it's
going to
just
vote.
that-
We're not going to vote on anything else before NDP2, of course.
Okay, yeah, but I guess the only point I would make to that, and I appreciate your ruling, Mr. Chair, but none of that was ever introduced by the government until basically a few minutes ago. So we've been dealing with this amendment for hours and hours, and even in the original intervention by the government, they really didn't deal with this issue, and all of a sudden it's coming up now. So perhaps in the future we could have some more courtesy with regards to why we spend so much time on something and then see another thing come to fruition.
Duly noted, Mr. Massé. Appreciate your comment. I'll yield the floor back to Mr. Turnbull.
Yeah, I mean, in this committee, there's lots of things that are worked on the fly. And in this particular case, we're trying to create a sub-amendment that both aligns with Quebec and deals with some of the concerns that committee members have raised. I call that compromise, call that collegiality, a constructive process. Those are the intentions behind circulating that. So I sort of take issue with the sentiments from Mr. Massey on that. It's actually a constructive way to move forward. And we think that I think it actually deals with a lot of the concerns that committee members have brought up. Obviously, we can debate that. And I do think that, because G2 hinges on the vote on NDP 2, that it's perfectly legitimate to bring that up and have the conversations about how these concepts work together, all on the same definition of anonymize, and I think that's important. So I wonder, I don't know if there's a path forward here, but I wondered if we had a moment to suspend and consider the wording, whether we could find a path forward on what I've circulated and then come back and vote on NDP 2. So, Chair, respectfully, I would ask if committee members would be willing to suspend for just 5 minutes and consider and see if we can find a path forward on both NDP 2 and G2, and when we come back, perhaps we can vote.
I'm inclined to allow to suspend for 5 minutes, and then when we come back, we vote on NDP 2. So is that fair with everyone?
Well, just let's make it clear. Is what we do is we go in camera virtually, so the public doesn't see what happens as we negotiate something with closed cameras and closed doors, and then we re-emerge with a decision after we've been in public all this time. So I just want to be clear on that.
I understand, Mr. Massé, that Mr. Garon has read the text of the sub-amendment that was sent to committee members on the record, so that's essentially what will be discussed by members. But the only reason I see is that for some time members can really read the text, take some time to read it, and then if we want to debate some more, we can always debate some more, but NDP2 will still be, of course, on the agenda and ready to be voted on when we come back in, I'd say 5 minutes, because we're already almost done with this meeting. So 5 minutes for members to read the sub-amendment, and we'll be back. believe the white smoke has emerged. So, Mr. Turnbull.
Yeah, if I may. So we had a good discussion among all of the different parties represented and their vice chairs, and just discussed how we could work on a sub-amendment to NDP 2. And essentially what we would do is take out generally accepted best practices, but still include language on reasonably foreseeable risk. And so to add that back in, that we would work on wording to return to the committee at our next meeting so that we could move past this fairly quickly. That would obviously mean G2 would not be moved or would not be admissible, I guess. So we'll do that work in the interim between now and the next meeting so we can get past NDP 2 and move on. That's what we agreed to. And then the only other thing is I know Mr. Perkins has a motion that he wanted to deal with, and we thought perhaps we could deal with that for the last 10 minutes, Chair, if you're okay with that.
You're making my life and my job very easy, Mr. Turnbull. Thank you very much. So we'll get back at the next meeting with the NDP2 as amended. So, Mr. Perkins, the floor is yours for your motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, MP Turnbull. And I think there was a caveat there, which is that MP Massey wants to make sure and be comfortable with the wording, since it's his original amendment to the bill. But thanks for doing that. We put on notice last week a motion, and we've had. Won't go over Schedule versus Schedule 1 again, but in that discussion, we're talking about Schedule 1 and Schedule 2. And one of the concerns we have is that around Schedule 2, I talked about, but that the Deputy Minister spoke to a group of lawyers at the TD Bank Tower and basically said that the content management definition of high-impact systems would allow them basically to ask for and access AI algorithms basically in any content moderation that I believe he termed as bias. So with that, I'd like to move the following motion that in relation to Bill C-27, an act to amend the Consumer Privacy Protection Act, the Personal Information and Data Protection Tribunal Act, and the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, and to make consequential and related amendments to other acts. And given that Simon Kennedy, the Deputy Minister of Innovation, Science, and it says economic development here, but I think it meant industry, was the keynote speaker at the, quote, Business Leaders Breakfast at McCarthy Tetro Strategic Advisors at the TD Bank Tower on November 7th, 2023, and B, given that the Deputy Minister read from a pre-approved 20-minute speech discussing the department's most recent developments on the use of AI, which included discussions of moderating and prioritizing the social media content Canadians see for the purposes of combating online misinformation through Bill C-27, the committee therefore orders the production of, 1, the draft speaking notes recommended to the Deputy Minister use for the department in relation to the breakfast speech, and 2, the final version of the speaking notes which the Deputy Minister relied upon during his appearance at the breakfast, provided that those documents shall be deposited with the clerk of the committee in both official languages no later than, it said today, I'm going to suggest April 22nd, that's a week from now, 2024, but perhaps somebody could give us an indication if that's enough time to get it in both official languages, since I'm not aware whether it was produced in such a language. So we could obviously be flexible by another week, perhaps in that date, but surely with the translation resources available to the Government of Canada, that the Deputy Minister's speech could be translated within 2 weeks.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. I have Mr. Turnbull on the motion.
Yeah, so we don't have a problem with this. I think the only thing was the date. Could we amend to say as soon as possible? Would that be sufficient for the Conservatives? And that way, you're sure to get it as soon as we can make it available.
Well, Mr. Perkins.
I understand understand the amendment. Well, Pedro, and that's why I suggested the 22nd or perhaps a week later. But I think nothing focuses the mind like hanging in the morning. So if we could set a date, that would be perhaps more appropriate to make sure that the government works towards a specific date. So I would suggest, say, 2 weeks from now, and if that's a problem, obviously, that could be conveyed to the clerk, and we can seek another more reasonable time.
So let's say May 1st, would that work?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So is there a consensus to have the date at the end of the motion be May 1st? Merci. And is there a consensus on the motion, or is there any more debate on this? Do I need a vote? No. Okay, so the motion is adopted. Thank you, Mr. Perkins. And thanks to the officials for joining us yet again today, and see you Wednesday. Meeting adjourned. I'll go check with them.